Welcome to the No Show. My name's Andrea Edwards.
And my name is Joe Augustin. And to my right on your screen is the chairwoman of the ESG Institute, helping us today with our program and helping businesses with sustainability, Anna Flynn. She's an artist as well, enjoys a good wine from time to time, but in a pinch, she'll take the bad wine too. Anna, welcome to the
No,
show.
no, she won't.
No. Seriously, it's not worth the hangover. It is not worth the hangover, and it is absolutely fabulous to be back on the No Show. To know.
No, it's good. It's good to have you back. And so we've got a lot of audience members from all over the world who might not have met you before. So do you want to just give everyone a lowdown on Joanne Flynn or Anna?
Okay, so as you've already gathered, I have more than one name. So my official name is Joanne. Family and friends call me Anna, and both Andrea and Joe know my third name, which is Booth Astor, which is my whole artist identity. Because if you're going to have an artist identity, go hell for leather and do the entire artist creation. So that's one part of my life. My business identity is the chairwoman of the ESG Institute, and we work with business leaders who are wanting to make commercially sound decisions on their sustainability journey. So how do you make the right decisions at the right times, do the right things by the planet, but also the right things by your investors and shareholders?
Yeah. And where's your book? Have you got it? I've only got one handy.
I do not have it right on my fresh little green hand. And I am the author of Green Sight, the Sustainability Guide for Company Directors, because we found one of the things that, like in any field, when we don't know what's going on, it's really hard to make the appropriate and right direction and decisions. So the Sustainability Guide helps leaders go, what's going on? How we need to think about it strategically. What's the right thing to do now? What's the right thing to do later?
Cool.
Well, anyway, if you just joined us for the show for the first time, quick introduction to the format of the show. We like to have diversity in terms of points of view on the show. We'd like to find the people who can give us a different angle on stuff. And we also talk about, in terms of the show itself, some of the news that perhaps you didn't see. So there's a lot of news that is completely in the focus of the world right now, but some aspects that perhaps weren't sort of on your radar. But we will be touching on some things this week because of the new news that's come out of the US, which I think is on everyone's lips, but we get to say our little thing on it as well. So we start off with some quick takes, and then we'll come back to the theme of the show today, which is the show must go on. It's rooted, I guess, inspired by some of the things that are happening a bit in my life, and I guess everybody else who's actually on the show as well, and I bet it's for you as well. So we'll come back to that in a while. Shall we get going with the quick takes and then do the thing?
Do the thing.
Yeah.
When I sent you the news last night, of course, in Asia, we hadn't heard the real news of the day, which is, of course, Donald Trump is guilty, and he is guilty of all 34 counts, which is for falsifying business records. We have to wait until July till we see what happens, and there's lots of conversation about that. But I've got to tell you, this is a great day for memes. If you want to be entertained on social media, there's some shenanigans going on, and people are having a lot of fun with it. And I kind of get that, especially in the US. People are emotional in both directions on this topic. But just wanted to ask you guys, how did you both feel waking up and hearing the news?
Well, actually, I didn't wake up to hear the news. I read the latest edition of the script before we went on. I went like, "Oh, that's good," and went to find out more. I mean, I'm also relieved that the verdict has come down. What happens beyond this is a separate thing. But what's interesting is the Trump isn't realizing what he's saying by his comments immediately after. He's called the verdict a shambles. He's basically said nasty things about the verdict. But actually, what he's doing when he's saying that is he's saying that a jury of his peers who convicted him after hearing all that. It's actually, I think, an interesting moment. People can begin to talk about how he doesn't respect anyone.
Yeah, I got Clinton here. DJT guilty, absolutely. So one of the really funny things about it was one of the jurors only gets her news from Truth Social. So the jurors were 100% guilty. There was no, it just only took one person. So, they tried a case and found him guilty. So that was kind of interesting. Anna?
I thought it was a very powerful case for what it takes for democracy to hold itself together. And because I know most of the people here will have no idea of my background. I grew up in countries that went through riots, revolutions, and coups. So I've seen the failure of a social system like democracy, and highly, highly value the stability and what happens when you have a functioning democracy. So to me, the whole process of actually getting it into the court, it working through the process to go through a jury, to a group of peers, and peers being other people of, New York City, and Donald Trump's from New York, saying, this is how we read the facts that were put in front of us. And therefore we say it's guilty, it's guilty, it's guilty. And that's a hugely significant thing. And I'm sure they weighed all the other consequences, quite, in the backgrounds of their mind, because, those conversations are not trivial conversations. But to have that sense of, irrespective of who you are, the system operates equally, to me, is a very, very fundamentally powerful signal.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court's not looking as trustworthy, but yeah.
Yeah, one layer
Well,
at a time.
it's the ultimate court of appeal, so it could wind up there. If it approves the case coming up to that level, we'll see how it goes. We'll move on from Trump now to another leader, the Pope, this time in the headlines. Not for the best things. He's reported to have made a homophobic comment against LGBTQI plus community. Now, in his apology, there's an interesting use of the phrase, to those who felt offended by the term reported by others. And I was reading on how and what was actually said. It was in the middle of a meeting. It was kind of an internal meeting amongst the bishops, but it was kind of a talk about, I wouldn't say not out of alignment with what he was trying to say in terms of the, shall we say, the HR policies of the Catholic Church in terms of who they bring on in terms of priests. They've been very clear about not bringing on gay men. They're not for that. But
I don't think they're for women either.
Yes, they're not very much for women in that respect. However, they are also engaged in other ways. But regarding this particular term that was used, I actually kind of, and it's terrible for me to say this, and as I told Andrea before doing the show, for another reason, I thought I would say some things to get cancelled, but I might start early. I found it a little funny actually that they have a term in Italian that kind of fits it. I don't know if I can say it without causing real problems, but the fact that they have a word that roughly translated and inverted commas, and I'm quoting, says faggotness, is kind of stuff that's going to show up on a comedy room somewhere. But he's apologized for that, and I can fully understand the idea about the term when they talk about reported by others, because it's one of those things. It's usually going to travel when someone says something about something, and then someone says something about someone saying something, and that kind of changes the context as well.
Yeah. All right, Anna?
Oh, so the next one. So moving right along, because we've gone and taken two big, strong male figures. So we're going to go and take a fruit down next. I mean, like, how else do you segue off to two of the most powerful men on the planet? We're not even going to touch some of the other ones that are out there.
Powerful people, the Pope.
Okay, so here you go. So some of you may have noticed that it's getting a little bit hotter around here. Everywhere around the world is getting hotter around here. And what's happening as a consequence of that is orange juice is having a tragic time. In fact, orange juice makers are considering using other fruit like bananas to make orange juice. I have got no idea how they're going to manage that.
No, they're not using bananas.
They're talking about using other fruits to make orange juice. And I just love the joke about going, which is bananas, but hey, why not? They're both tropical. Hey, it's consistent. It's consistent. They're both tropical. Anyhow, so if you really want some geeky facts, their harvests in Brazil have dropped by 24%, which, hey, Sandrine, which basically means for 70% of their exporters, orange juice is going, they can't export because they can't get hold of it, which means for you and me at home, either really sip and enjoy your orange juice right now because it, along with lots of other things, are going to get harder to come by. And two, think about what kind of fruits you can value locally because that might be what you get to drink.
Yeah.
I think your screwdrivers are heading towards the daiquiri, the daiquiri side of things.
Exactly. You got to work out your mixtures.
Oh, we have fresh juice every day, so I was like, oh.
Pineapple, darling. Pineapple's local.
Yeah, no, we definitely focus on that. So moving down south into New Zealand, and it voted in a right-wing government in its last election. And before anyone in New Zealand attacks me, I know you guys are all very passionate about your side of politics. I don't really care which government you have. What I do care about is, are your government earth stewards? And it appears that Christopher Luxon and his team are not. So they've just released their first budget and they've announced sweeping cuts to climate projects right across the board with no new significant environmental investments. So one of the things every country's got to be focused on now is adaptation plans. And while they do mention some money towards that, it's nowhere near enough. So right-wing governments aren't really looking like the right sort of side of things when it comes to taking the right action on climate change and keeping their citizens safe, which is the most important part. Joe?
Now, I'm not picking on the guy, but Donald Trump has been in the news for other reasons as well. He was in the wrong room at the right time, I guess. Invited to speak at the Libertarian National Convention, he went on stage and basically proposed to the audience that they unite with him because Joe Biden would be the end of democracy. Attendees at the convention were not as easily taken as other conventions he's been used to speaking at. They were audible, well, I would say audible, out loud calls of bullshit and the FUs and other stuff that couldn't be, well, actually, I can say them here, but I won't. But yeah, it's a challenge that the Republican presidential nominee is facing to broaden his appeal both left and right of the political spectrum. The Libertarians represent about 3% of the vote, which could come in very, very crucial, especially in the swing states. Well, all the small groups are going to come in very, very crucial in the swing states.
Yeah.
Which gets on to really the next kind of one of people swinging back and forth. So I don't know how many of you remember there was this lady called Nikki Haley who was aiming to be a president of the Estados Unidos. Anyhow, so she said she was never going to endorse Trump. So she is now endorsing Trump. But I suspect if you're in the Republican thing, it's sort of do that or die. So, you know, at one level, I got a certain amount of empathy because there are very, very few Republicans left who basically are standing on the principles that they don't, you know, I mean, the McCains are one of the few ones that are left. Anyhow, so, but, you know, one of the weird things is, so you've made these decisions, then you go to another country, you go and visit refugees, and then you go to a memorial service and you write on the bullets, finish them. And you just kind of go like, what are you thinking? Like, I have due respect for people who have the courage to go into battle and fight for what they believe. But I also have seen what happens when societies collapse. So I do think there's a balance in this entire thing. But the going and showing care for people who are being shot at and then going and saying, it just doesn't compute in my world.
Yes, another nasty person, right? It's just, yeah, those sort of people, yeah, it just makes you sick. The lack of empathy and compassion. You can support a side without, you know, being that person.
Well, I mean, I think what I'm going to say here, it's not just about support. All of this is about, you know, it's about it's about what's happening back home. None of this is about Israel. I mean, that's that phrase.
Or Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, it isn't designed for them. It's designed to play at home, which is, I don't know. I just think it's designed to satisfy the base. It is exactly what the rhetoric, you know, generally is, and I think it's terrible when the political process takes precedence over just being diplomatic. I mean, you know, there is something that can be done, that it can be done better, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I think the bigger thing was it was happening on Memorial Day when she should have been honouring Americans fallen, right? So it was a double whammy. Moving on, published in Reuters, a senior member of a Russian think tank whose ideas actually sometimes become government policy has suggested Moscow consider a demonstrative nuclear explosion to cow the West into refusing to allow Ukraine to use its arms against Russia. So obviously for me, this gets a big yeah, nah. But I've got to say, like, it's time really. We've got to tackle Russia more aggressively. That they're playing so many games. I think the West is being so soft in its response. I mean, we've seen a lot of shifts in the last week with Europe, first of all, saying that Ukraine can use its weapons in Russia. And I think just in the last 24 hours, it looks like it's official policy that America has said they can use their weapons in the Ukraine in Russia across the border because. You know, we just got to get this done. We've got to get this done and finished. It's just a crazy war.
We're coming back to another Nicki in the news this time. This time it's Nicki Minaj. She was arrested in Amsterdam on suspicion of exporting soft drugs before being fined 350 euros. Some of you will pick up on the irony of getting arrested for drugs, anything in Amsterdam, but apparently there are certain laws that are in place, although they usually apply quite laxly. However, the delay caused the concert to be postponed in Manchester, where the fans, well, were not as pleased with the way things were handled. I mean, some of it was actually the arena and how they also, how the venue kind of addressed the situation. It could be a combination with hopeful thinking that didn't pan out. I like the bit in the reporting where they lined up the I think the flight data of where the plane that was going to be carrying the actor, the pop star, was going to be, and it said basically that the show was canceled after 3 hours when the pop star's plane was still in Amsterdam. So that wasn't the best handled of situations. Some of the fans have said they're no longer fans. A lot of them have said they don't like the venue. But then again, that's just continuing. There's more about that venue. It's been having lots of problems.
Although
Can you imagine being
I do have to correct the old man in the room. It's not a pop. She's not a pop star. She's a rapper.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Exactly. Can you imagine being the warm-up act?
Yeah.
And doing 3 hours of sets just to try. Let's keep this going. Okay, so continuing to move along here. So we've had horrific tornadoes in the U.S. But what I found really amazing in actually watching the news is that in Papua New Guinea, which is a fairly big island somewhere in between where we are here in Singapore and Australia, we've had over 2,000 people die through landslides. And that's just an astronomical number of people. Can you imagine I don't even want to imagine what the imagining would be here, because just to have that happen in your community, to be in the society and with that's happened. Now, I mean, some of my family have worked in PNG, and they just describe, it's really seriously up and down mountainsides. Like, this is not a place that's easy to get around, to getting the roads in. So even for rescuers to get in to see if they can, help and rescue anyone, much less be able to identify and bury those who have passed away, which, is hideous, because every culture has its own ways of remembering and respecting the dead. And what's traditionally possible there is just not at all possible. So, yet another one where it's sort of like hashtag, climate's winning the day.
Yeah, so I was checking out whether or not it was a result of deforestation, because a lot of the landslides that happen in the developing part of the world definitely come from that. But it's so high up in the mountains, it just looks like a natural event. And it was so deadly because it was just these huge boulders came down. It was like 3 o'clock in the morning. It just wiped out this entire village while they were sleeping. And and of course, it doesn't get as much coverage as the other things that are going on in the world. And we've seen a fair bit of unfair coverage. 2,000 people in Papua New Guinea are not as valuable from a media perspective as 19 people in the US suffering, which is equally sad, right? But it's unbalanced. But I just want to, just before we move on to the main section, I want to encourage everyone. There's 2 articles. So the first one it's in the New Yorker, and it's called "Images of Climate Change That Cannot Be Missed." And it's this amazing photography. I always love photography, but there's an exhibition called Coal and Ice that if you're in New York, go and have a look at it. And one of the photographers in this exhibition, he captures people when they return to their homes after devastating floods. And his main focus is floods, but not all of them. And so everyone's standing outside of their home with water up to their waists as they have that first experience. So the news gets them running away from their homes. He gets them returning to their homes. So very powerful. And, Donald Trump's the man of the hour. So I think this is a must read. So just yesterday, I think, there was this article in Slate titled "The Donald Trump I Saw on The Apprentice." So basically the writer was under an NDA for 20 years, and it's actually quite significant what would happen if he broke his NDA, but it's now expired, so it's a blistering account. So I think that article will have a big impact too, and it really talks about the show, The Apprentice, and how manipulated we all were. Very interesting.
I haven't read the entire article, and I need to actually sit down and read it more properly. But what really stood out to me is the way he's using language, saying, it was like a con setup. It was set up to deliberately manipulate and deceive, not just in the sort of like, let's over polish influencer marketing where, I've got a Zoom filter so that my skin looks a little bit younger, like deliberately really make things look significantly not what they are. And that's, so it's worthy of reading, and it'll be interesting what happens next as a consequence of now with I hadn't realized it was 20 years. Oh my God.
Yeah, the big thing about TV production, especially when it comes to reality TV, is that it's usually shocking to the rest of the world how it works. So as much as it sounds like the whole thing is a con, I'm going to say a lot of that is going to work for almost any other reality show that you've been watching, unfortunately. But that's what it is.
And the article really talks through that, the sort of the philosophy and behind those sort of shows. Because I used to watch The Apprentice. Steve and I used to have a laugh until it just got to the point where, people going against each other, attacking each other, it just doesn't suit my spirit. But initially entertaining, then not. And then later, this man is dangerous. We need to be very aware of him. And here we are today.
I will always remember Emarosa.
Yeah.
Shall we dig into the big stories now? There's a story that's happening in Hong Kong, and again, I think if based on the way our social media feeds go, I think you may or may not have seen this. The Hong Kong 47 trial. 14 activists have been found guilty of conspiracy to commit subversion in Hong Kong. And when you hear that headline, it's important to think about how news works and how law works as well at the same time. There is the impact of what you hear. So that first headline is about activists found guilty of conspiracy to commit subversion. And then there's finding out what exactly they did. So what they're accused of doing is the very subversive act of running primaries pre-elections. And in and of themselves, those do not sound like very terrible things. They don't sound so subversive, but it's always in the context, right? So the context of it is they were the primaries, which had been run before in the past. So there's sort of a new thing technically in Hong Kong, but the context had changed in the sense that there were some new laws that had been introduced very recent to the time when these primaries were run. And I think the chief, the people in charge of the legislature had kind of cautioned that these things may be illegal before they were done as well. And they went ahead, and because the laws are designed that way, they crossed the legal lines, and they broke that law, right? Of course, internationally, there's a lot of support. For democracy, saying that these things that a lot of criticism for the fact that this whole trial has happened, that the acts are considered as acts of subversion, and that part of it for me really is kind of expected. I think the challenge really is for the people who are in Hong Kong and about how they live their lives and what they're able to do and what they're not able to do. And I think on its on the surface, when you're referencing it, I think from a wholly Western perspective, it sounds like nothing can be said, nothing can be done. You cannot go up against the government. And I think there's something that is sort of a little bit, well, I won't say a little bit. It's quite left of that or quite right of that, depending on how you look at things. There's a way, I think, to engage and try and influence change, and then there's a way where you are acting in a way which I was actually thinking about this in terms of how sometimes people behave with landlords, and I think the relationship that Hong Kong has with China has to be acknowledged, that it actually is the landlord returning, and the landlord wants certain things to be in a certain way because, after all, it's their land. But you have tenants who have a very deep attachment to what's going on, and they kind of like things the way they were before. And some are going to really, really want things not to change back, or before they hand it back, or as they hand it back. So, as much as I think there's going to be an external point of view that looks at this and goes like, they're going to be supportive of these of the activists, and I do have sympathy and empathy for them. I also at the same time feel that it's kind of the law of the land, and it's kind of something that was coming, and we are all entitled to try and do something about it. But this is what happens when there's also law that is in place specifically to take away the ability to do this, right? So it's a complicated thing. It certainly isn't as easy from inside to try and do the things that people are trying to do. I'm not really sure if it's okay. There's a lot of Western intervention in terms of the rhetoric that's come out of this, right? And I don't know what happens when you describe everything that someone is doing. I'll just say that someone is doing as terrible, bad. It's just wrong. If you give them any room to try to do something else instead. So that's how I kind of feel on this, or think about this particular subject. It is difficult in Hong Kong. There are lots of things that are still going right in Hong Kong in the midst of all this. So while you have something like this happening and people saying that it's terrible in that way, Singapore is experiencing, or these companies in Singapore are experiencing something interesting as well, as in a lot of people are going back to Hong Kong to live there for other reasons. So that's where it is.
Yeah, it did seem like there was a mass exodus. I suppose one of the interesting things about Hong Kong for me has always been, up until 20 years ago, we all had friends who were born and bred and raised in Hong Kong who were not Chinese, and so they're deeply connected and they have strong opinions. They're not living there now, of course, and then of course we have our Hong Kong friends who are Asian Chinese who were born and bred, who can't necessarily express their opinions. So it's actually quite difficult to sort of hear any other point of view. But to me, I don't know. It just, how do you fight that dad, or what do you call it, the landlord? How do you fight that? It's too big, and I don't know. Maybe over time they can find some compromise, but yeah, it's a different city to what it was, right?
Well, I mean, look, that's just the way change happens to any place. Sorry, Anna, you were saying?
Well, it's a tough one for people who have been resident there, who used to a certain way of life. But the world, I mean, the hard piece, I mean, like I remember going to Hong Kong in the 70s and 80s, like forever ago. And it's a hugely different place now to where it was then. And, in 50 years, it'll be hugely different yet again. But that said, same is true of Singapore, same is true of Manila, same is true of even New York or London. It's easy to because Hong Kong is this nice demarcated spot with this fascinating history. It's quite easy to go and talk about the stories there but changes in social expectations and degrees of freedom. Because I mean, what we have in some other parts of the world, we've got huge degrees of freedom with so much, fake news and misinformation. That's not a very healthy system either, because the ability to connect and trust people and what they're saying and feel that there's integrity of what's going to happen as a consequence of what's being said is pretty, it's not what it used to be. And so, Hong Kong's good to target, but it's kind of symptomatic rather than the system.
One of those classic examples of nuance, Joe.
Yeah, well, I mean the nuance thing, yes, and then there's also this thing about looking at things from a perspective, right? Would you say that things are worse in Hong Kong today than 10 years ago or 20 years ago? And I think it would depend on where you're sitting, right? You have to be looking at certain things and you go like, oh, it's much worse now, and in other ways you can go like, oh, it's much better now as well. And there's a propensity for us to want to insist that some stuff is wrong. It's a natural thing for us to do that, and many times, what can happen is fashion can catch on, right? And it goes both ways. It can be on the when history looks at it, can be both good and bad as well. But it's a kind of a fashion of thinking that kind of works in the end. And I'm going to draw it back to Singapore if I can, because Singapore wasn't a popular idea in terms of how government and democracy worked. It's still, I would say, quite unpopular among some people, but it's a lot less now because people have kind of seen what's happened over time. And I think there's this great fear that, and again, look, it's the PR machine of the West from long ago. China bad, China this. Why it's really terrible. And I'll be very frank about it. I am very Western in the way I think about it as well. But at the same time, if I had bought the ideas about how terrible Singapore was and not come here, and therefore because of my exercise of my freedom and everything I was doing, I could be working in a subway in Australia right now. I could be very happy with that existence. Certainly wouldn't be on this show, wouldn't be doing the things that I was doing.
Your customers would be happy. You'd have great relationships with your customers, having good chats every day.
I'm not sure if I'd be having those either, actually.
So I find the concept, Anna raised the concept of freedom, is something that we value so much in the West, but there's also a cost of freedom, and are we willing to continue to accept the cost? And there was a Singaporean interview just in the last week. I can't remember his name, and he was talking about the Western mindset versus the Asian mindset, and he came up with some really good points. So pay attention to other points of view, right? That's what we're always saying.
Yep.
And just on that one, so see, one of the pieces that I have highly valued living in Asia, in Singapore, people make so many comments about Singapore about being super controlled and you can't say things, and in some ways that's the part of the underlying dynamic, Joe, that you were talking about in Hong Kong. And it's true. There's, mind your P's and Q's is definitely the case. However, the freedom we have in Singapore is that, and in Hong Kong too, is we can walk around as women, as kids, as people who aren't like great big tough guys with double black, belts. And we're set physically safe. We have freedom of physical safety in a way that some other places simply don't. And that freedom is actually highly, highly valuable.
Yep.
We used to send our son Lex to a school in a taxi because it was the only way he could get there by himself when he was 4. That's Singapore. Yeah, that's Singapore. Wouldn't do it anywhere else. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, all right. That's a huge freedom. Yeah. Go on, Andrea. What next?
There's also a very, very quick flip side to think about. Think about the criminals who feel unsafe in Singapore. Okay, we're done.
Oh, bless them.
So Mexico's been obviously getting a lot of attention because it's going through an extreme heat wave, which is obviously going up into the US. We've seen a lot of extreme heats in Florida, Texas is suffering from it. And, you know, the story in Mexico definitely got the attention because the howler monkeys are falling out of trees. Another, there was a bit of a miss sort of, it's not a misinformation. It was reporting it was going to be the highest temperatures in Mexico had ever seen. And then people repeated it as the highest temperatures we'd ever seen. But that's not happening in Mexico. That's happening in India and Pakistan. And so this hasn't been getting anywhere near the amount of attention that we're seeing on the other side of the world. But in the last few days, the media is definitely starting to pay attention because the heat in New Delhi this week got up to 52.3 degrees Celsius, which is 126 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is a temperature that's never been seen before. But there are some conversations going on that the temperature could be inaccurate on one of the measuring stations which reported that actual temperature. But regardless, the temperature is still up around 50, 51, 52 degrees Celsius. So, and that's real feel, not wet bulb temperature. And so in Jaipur, the capital of Rajasthan in India, which is a magnificent place to visit, the morgues are filling up. And one of the commentaries that happened really, really low in an article. So I'm always looking for wet bulb temperature deaths or heat stroke deaths. And it's so difficult and challenging to find this information. Sometimes we don't even know until years later. But it says in Rajasthan's capital, Jaipur, so many bodies of casualties of the heat have arrived at the mortuary that its capacity has been exceeded. Many of the victims are poor labourers who have no choice but to work outside, and of course homeless people. And if you've ever been to visit India, millions and millions of people live on the streets all year round. So there's been some footage of some school kids who are suffering from heat stroke, and they're being cared for, and it's very distressing. Of course, if it was your own children, you'd really feel that. And then another viral video that started going around just in the last couple of days is a water truck that's arriving in an area in Delhi, and people are scrambling all over the truck trying to get to the water. Because, crazily enough, another issue with extreme heat is water shortages. And in India, they've announced water rationing. So, but watching all of this, you know, I'm obviously concerned for all life that is going through this extreme heat, including the animals. And we've just come through 3 months of extreme heat here in Thailand, and I know in Singapore it's been much hotter than usual. But our actual temperatures were 35, 36 degrees Celsius, with wet bulb temperatures sort of sitting in the 45, 46 degrees range. And it was horrible. Wow. But in India and Pakistan, it's 50 degrees Celsius real temperatures. So I don't even actually know what the wet bulbs are. I might check my weather app soon. And, you know, when we walked outside during the last 3 months, you just get this mouthful of heat and you're constantly perspiring, which is a good sign. When you stop perspiring, that's a bad sign. That's a heat stroke sign. But in India, they're talking about it's like breathing fire. So yeah. I'm feeling a bit frustrated, a bit disappointed, a bit angry about the lack of preparation, because not all of it needs to happen. It doesn't all need to cost a lot of money. So one of the solutions that I put in my blog is all schools across the global south should turn into cooling centres. They should have solar panels and air conditioning so people can go to them in these states of emergency, and the kids' education can still happen. And then we won't see those kids falling around suffering from heat stroke. They should also put medical centres in these, because if you can't get to medical attention quickly and you've got heat stroke, you can die. So, you know, in Phoenix, they were filling body bags full of ice, you know, so that's a lesson that we can take on board. The poor suffer the most, but the wealthy will only be able to survive as long as the grid doesn't fall over. Another topic that's really hard to get information on. We know that there have been collapse of the grid in various parts, but when it gets really, really hot, it's impossible for the people to get out there in their trucks and actually fix it, because everything is burning hot. There was one guy who's a builder, you know, just touching the steel, you know, you get 3rd-degree burns. So also the poor people, you know, you've got fruit sellers, you've got tuk-tuk drivers. I mean, if you're using one of these people regularly, why don't you just give them a living wage so they don't have to be out in the heat? And then, you know, they might be there at the end of the heat extreme and still continue to serve you. One topic that's not really getting a lot of attention is kidney damage that comes from being in extreme heat for long periods of time. A lot of the foreign workers from India, Bangladesh and Pakistan go to the Middle East to build. And when they come home, all that money that they've earned while working abroad is lost because they've basically got to pay for dialysis. So there's a lot of people who are going to be suffering this. So we need to be investing this. And of course, the water shortages. I mean, how the hell are we even there? You know, the government knew the heat was coming. How can they not be prepared? They stocked up on coal. They knew that was important to keep the air conditioners running. So, you know, there's a lot of things that haven't been happening, and we talk about adaptation. You know, the preparation isn't happening, and the poorest people are facing the brunt of this, but it doesn't take many more degrees of temperature before everyone who's living in these heat extremes is going to face the deadly consequences. So first chapter of Ministry for the Future feels very, very close. And, you know, we've got a lot of friends in India. I've been checking on them, friends in Pakistan as well. Just really thinking about everyone we know as well as those we don't know. This is a devastating event.
I mean, and this is, you know, to take that heat extremes and what it's doing to individuals and communities, you know, and particularly where it's, because, you know what, I mean, frankly, you know, we're all lucky, those of us that are listening here, you know, we're lucky enough to be in places and wealthy enough to thank God for aircon, really.
Yeah.
Because, you know, it is hard. It's hard to mentally function, and much less if you're actually physically outside laboring. But you get that same pressure that we're feeling on our bodies, and then you go and say, well, what's this doing to the agricultural system, to the farming systems? So, you know, while we're making jokes about orange juice going bananas and turning into banana juice, the reality is this increased heat is already hitting crop yields. So I'm not going to quote myself on that, so this is coming with a caveat, but I know the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has been talking about the climate impact on food crisis, but we're already seeing, and this is the piece that I don't have strong data on, but I was reading it, but I can't tell you the exact place, was that I think there's already been a 24% decrease in the yields in certain crops. So we heard about the orange juice, but say rice, for example. So we take, you know, rice, you know, which is, you know, Asia. We live on it. Have you eaten? Have you had rice today? That's like the basic question. And rice yields are dropping because of the heat, and we've only just seen nothing yet compared to take ourselves out 7 years or a decade out, what it will be like. And it's just, so people are going like, oh, and I'm going like, yeah, you start taking food out. And that's when you start having famine, and that's when you start having people fighting each other, and then you have mass migrations of people trying to move, and then the social issues that happen. And we have billions more people on the planet than the last time we had this round.
Yeah.
These sorts of issues of food loss across massive numbers of countries. We've got billions of people now in this category. It's just mind-boggling, the lack of willingness.
So 50% of the world's population relies on rice for 80% of its food and dietary requirements. So the number's huge. And rice crops start to fail once you pass 35 degrees Celsius. So the entire rice growing region of the world has been above 35 degrees Celsius for the last 3-4 months. So just think about that, right?
I do.
Yeah, so
I grew up at a rice research institute. I really do think about this.
But 25, I think it's 24 or 25% of the UK's wheat is also down because of floods and excessive rain, and they're about to hit the most rain they'll ever experience in a summer since like sometime in the 1800s. So yeah, it's a big issue, and let's move into the next topic, because that's exactly what you're going to talk about, Anna.
We've already been talking about, I mean, so you know, we've been talking about how this agricultural piece is coming through, but, you know, like really tie it down to what we're seeing in Israel and Palestine. We've got the climate and the heat, we've got social conflict, you know, completely and utterly being escalated in that one tiny place, where you're seeing the damage of, if things are not structured and put together. So Gaza, they're saying people have, the tiny strip there has 80% of the world's 700,000 hungriest people in the world. You know, and that's only taken months. So you're thinking about what's happening in Syria, what's happening in Sudan, what's happening in Myanmar, and you just add these other places up, and you go like, that is a lot of people who are you're not just down at the malnutrition lens, which is pretty bad if you're living in the malnutrition lens. When we lived in Nigeria, you'd see the kids with the great big bellies, and it wasn't because they were eating; it was because they were so malnourished. And then because we're there just after the Biafran War, you see those that were, where it was the starvation, and the level of conflict that goes on when people can't eat is just absolutely, the tipping point of the escalation. And then because I spend so much time in business, and I hear people saying, "Oh, but we've got to, these assets are going to get," and I go like, "Wait a second, if social collapse will write off a lot of assets very, very fast." The sound business decision making, if you want to have a social system that you can keep selling your products to, is what will it take to preserve this system, rather than, okay, what will let it just float out there for another decade and increase the temperatures even more, and therefore all these other risks coming in, because the outcome of this makes the Mad Max movie look calm.
Yeah, so I want to ask you guys a question. So it's something I've been thinking a lot, right? So I was involved in a group of people, and so Joanna, just as COVID was taking off, and we had to announce that the event was cancelled. And there were a bunch of people that jumped on and said, "No, you guys are wrong. You're too quick to make this decision." And I was like, are you not seeing what I'm seeing? Are you not reading what I'm seeing? And I'm always looking ahead, right? What does this mean, and this mean, and this mean, and this mean, and what does it mean? Like on that, let's bring it all together. But I actually think we have a challenge in our society that too many people who make decisions aren't able to follow the threads forward. What do you guys think about that? Because I think it's a real problem that we need to be addressing. The long-term thinking that's required at this time. Like if your country is going to get devastated by heat waves, or it's going to get devastated by floods, and it's going to destroy 25, 50% of your crops, 80% of your crops in some cases, right? What does that mean? How are you going to cope? Like you look at Zimbabwe, Tanzania, going through an extreme drought and famine, they're just getting worse and worse, and the media is starting to pick it up, right? But in India, why weren't they ready? In Pakistan, why weren't they ready? Wasn't the communication that's happening now to help people protect themselves from heat? Why didn't it happen before? Tell them to paint their roofs white. Plant trees. Do these things, right? Why? Where's that? Why is that lacking? That's what I'm struggling with. I'm just a girl from Wodonga who's working stuff out. What about our leaders? What are they doing? Do you know what I mean?
What are all those smart guys doing, Joe? Tell us.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think of it in terms of time frame, and I think about what is most significant to most people in the time frame that they have, and what is drawing their attention, right? And I'll go to a simple analogy, right? When you're a parent, what are you busy with today? It's what your kid's saying you need to do today, right? I mean, that's the way kind of things work. I will say that as much as I think I'm a responsible enough parent, I have not spent enough time thinking about my retirement and for the necessarily all the financial aspects that I should have been thinking for my family along the way. And these are all things that should have happened, and I consider myself to be a reasonable person. But I was caught up in more day-to-day things that happen. The problem with the way the world works in terms of power right now is power is derived from a process not connected directly with the problem it needs to be solving. As in, if you think about the environment, you think about all those things, it would be better if the Earth could vote, right? If the planets, if the rivers could somehow vote, if the sea could somehow vote, if the animals and plants could somehow vote, we'd have a different outcome. But what we do have right now is power that's derived on people assigning you the power based on something called voting by people who are not necessarily qualified. So we talk about this thing about why didn't they see this coming? Because the big they didn't think it was that much of an important thing. If you ask someone on the streets, I mean, and actually the surveys have been done as well. If you talk about what is the most important thing, we believe in groups where we talk about these things, that it's really high on the list of priorities, right? We talk about the next generation and what they think about most in the future. We hope that it's going to be all these topics, like the environment, like this, we hope it's all these things, right? But the reality is, when surveyed American students, for instance, of school-going age, of course they'd be school-going because they're the students, but their priorities are nothing to do with these big priorities. Yeah, we hear about the protests, but even when it comes to things like, for instance, the subject of Palestine, as much as it seems like it's the biggest thing on their mind, when surveyed, it's number 17 on the list.
Mm.
We have to be realistic about where power comes from, and where power comes from is the vote. The vote comes from concerns that are in certain areas, and this is where the communication of those who can see further has to come into play. And it's about communication. It's about
Yeah.
convincing more people that this is now important and this is the reason to vote about something in this way. So as much as all these things are coming and they're important, there are certain things that are going to be much more important relative. And this is not, I'm not saying it's not a wise situation. We're not necessarily going to be wise as we make our choices for what we want to do today, but that is the reality of the human condition. We are much more concerned about what we eat today, being able to eat today, than thinking about the long-term health that eating the same thing every day for the next 50 years is going to produce.
Mm. Yeah. Anna?
Being someone a bit like you, who I remember one of my clients saying to me, Joanne, you see beyond the obvious changes required, which I think is one way of being my secret sauce to success. The downside is, because I see beyond the obvious change required, I see the next set of things that need to be done. And it's sort of like being Cassandra. We can go, well, if this happens and this happens and that will happen, and you add those things together and that's over there, and you get a whole bunch of people just going like, I'm pissed off at you, you just made it more complicated than I wanted it to be. And two, I've only got this much brain space because XYZ's calling me over there. What can we get done in this? Because not that I'm disagreeing with that, but I literally can't process it because I'm busy over here. And that's just these days so much of also, the way things are. And this is a pre-internet thing, because I lived on a research station where all these topics that we're talking about now in terms of climate change was regular conversation. And that was when I was a little munchkin. And what we can say is over the last 35, 40 years is we've moved from an economic system that was leading to a 7-degree outcome to a 3.5-degree outcome. Thank you to all the various pieces of work. I do say that because it's sort of like, okay, it's really easy in this big picture, the doom and gloom, because we've covered a lot of very negative things, which are truthfully negative and were predictably negative, is to realize that there has been a movement from that 7-degree into that 3.5-degree. We're already going at 1.5. It's really not looking really great. So we need to keep that tilt and movement going because of the sorts of things that we've been talking about. Because unless you already are super in a very, very frozen part of the world, the increases in climate, in food loss, in floods, in hurricanes is really just going to be super damaging. And it actually, I was reading something the other day, and I'll send it on to you, Andrew. It was a bit of a science geeky thing, so it wasn't regular news. But they had one map about where heat is going to be coming and hitting, and then another map where water and flooding was going to be really bad. So the cold people get the floods, we get the heat. Either way, it's not nice.
But also it could get the ice if the AMOC falls over, right? So that's the thing. It depends on what goes first. It's an interesting time. So what we need, so people say democracy is failing, only 20% of countries left with democracy, down for 40%. And I actually think the problem of democracy is it's short-termism, 3-4 years, 5 years, maybe max. What we need to do is we need to have the politicians that we have, but then we should have another group of politicians and storytellers whose whole job is to look at what is coming and what needs to be done to prepare for it, and then communicate to the public, this is where we are, this is what we need to do, this is how it's going to impact you. But if we come together and do it together, like I was watching a climate change activist video yesterday, which I'll put in the weekend reads. It was fantastic. And, you know, they were talking about we need such positive energy around this, no matter how impossible it seems. And we need so much love for each other to get through this. But the first thing we've got to do is got to say, this is what's happening. Like, how do we prepare for the refugees? Right now, Mexico, it's going to run out of water. So trucks of water should be heading down from the US to give that water to the people, because if they don't, those people are going to head to the US, right? So, you know, how do we proactively manage the situation to stop the outcome that we don't want and to help the people who are going through the worst times, right? It's that sort of stuff. Come on, you know, it's obvious what's happening. Let's get on with tackling it. We can still do the other stuff, but we also, that slow down sort of vibe that's going out now in the climate movement, slow down, take it easy. You know, everyone's running around too much. So they're caught up in things that ultimately, you know, like even what's going on with Donald Trump, ultimately, from a climate and polycrisis perspective, it doesn't matter. Who's in power? Doesn't matter. What matters is we recognize the danger we're in and we start doing something about it.
Well, who's in charge matters a lot because of the compounding effect, and that's really where we are. I mean, today we are here, and you know, you talked about even the diversion from 7 to 3, or 3.5. It's a kind of a compounding thing, because, you know, when in the world that I live in terms of the things I do with trading, for instance, right? It isn't always the huge hits that make a big difference. It's the continued small hits that make a difference. And it goes in both directions. And so things can compound in that way. So, yeah, as much as it's sometimes oversimplified and says that this little small thing right now is not going to make a difference. Yeah, in and of itself, it isn't. But over the next 1,000 times it happens, it is. So we are where we are.
Can I just counteract that?
Yeah.
Because I think this is a really important point. Compounding effects. They're already in play.
Yeah.
It's already going to get worse.
Yes.
So if we have a climate leader or a non-climate leader like Donald Trump coming to power and he reverses everything that Biden's done.
Yeah.
It's going to mean that it's going to get worse faster, but it's still going to get worse no matter what we do. Even if we do everything, you know, even if we do everything right, it's still going to get worse. So,
well, what I'm getting at actually is the fact that the compounding effects of things that are right are also going to disappear. That is that's the dangerous part of it, because you know, like when I talk about the financial aspects of my own neglect of my financial future, as much as I did some things right, I've done a great number of things wrong. There are steps I'm taking right now which are going to have positive compounding effects for me, which, if stopped immediately, would just disappear. And those are the things that we really can't afford right now. We can't afford, you know, like a in terms of education, in terms of science funding, in terms of just trying to be common sense about things, that have things that are going to move in a positive direction and compound into the future in a good direction. If you kill all those things now, that is it's a kind of it's a long-term thing. It doesn't happen immediately. There are two curves happening at the same time. One is going on the way up and one is coming on the way down. And what we are trying to do is make them meet in a better place, you know, for all of us, because we don't want to be falling off the edge. And at which point, you know, it's always possible to try and compound your way back, but it's going to take, instead of 50 years, it might take 1,000 years, and that's the difference.
Yeah. All right. So moving on to another crisis. So bird flu is obviously a developing story, and we haven't got that in. But there was some pretty interesting stuff coming out around COVID, Joe.
Yeah. Well, so COVID isn't going away. It's changing. It's always coming up with a new edition. It's basically it's the Apple iOS of interesting diseases. And one of the things about it is, first of all, how it spreads. Secondly, it's how it affects the human body. And long COVID is basically the disease occupying space in your body for a long period of time. But the symptoms that fall under that are actually getting to be very, very interesting, or at least mysterious to science. Personality changes as well. And this is because of the way COVID attacks almost all kinds, all manner of cells in your body. There's maybe a link to the other story that was shared, or at least the paper that was published in Nature. This is one where they found that, especially in long COVID, what happened is it affected something called the post-exertional recovery of cells, both in terms of mental tasks as well as physical tasks. What that means is your body doesn't recover as well as it did before. Translated for some of our other viewers, it means you became 45. No, just kidding. It's a bit. It's
Gosh,
a bit
that'd
like
be
growing
nice
old.
again.
Yeah, getting cancelled. Okay, it's a bit about it's in some ways people are experiencing the effects of old age, I guess, in a younger time. The bodies aren't recovering as well and as quickly when it comes to physical exertion as well as mental exertion, and that's important as well. And that is actually maybe linked to this thing about personality change, because our minds and the way we process things are actually affected, especially when you have these kinds of situations. So if you're exposed to stress, your long work hours, and you have to do a lot of things, and you still have a bit of that, the brain fog. I was illustrating by not finding the words immediately. You can have all those things come together and really overwhelm you, because you aren't able to recover as much as you could before. So where perhaps if you were not suffering from long COVID and you were able to kind of like get your mental state back to balance with a night's sleep, for instance, if that same thing wasn't quite happening, because they were in the paper that was talked about in Nature, there was something about some of the other molecular cleanup processes that weren't quite happening, and some of those were to do with the mind. So it actually could lead to these psychiatric sort of outcomes. So
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
it's if you got long COVID, be very careful. You have to look after yourself, obviously. And those of you who are really thinking that you're over with COVID, I've been doing webinars, and I just did a webinar where we talked about the latest that's happening with COVID as well, the new variants, and in terms of what the best kind of protection you can have. I'll just share what I've learned. The best kind of immunity, and this is from a scientific perspective, that you can have is you have a combination of actually having the vaccine and an actual exposure or sort of what do you call it, an infection, right? So if you had two vaccines and the one infection, just in terms of the strongest immunity, you get it from that. It's in no way suggesting that you should go out and try and get immunity by exposing yourself to it. But the risk of stuff happening in COVID is still not fully understood. Despite all the vaccinations and despite how we suffer less from the upfront symptoms of it, we are discovering, as you just heard, lots more things that we didn't know before, which we're catching up with. One of the things that I talked about before, you know how China was trying to work on the zero COVID policy.
Yeah.
This is one of those things where I thought about it in terms of a global advantage that China could have had, and I'm sure at some point it must have been on their minds. If you had a large population, an entire country like China, who was not fundamentally weakened in some way by COVID, that would make it would perhaps be a significant advantage.
That's interesting. No, it's been really interesting. So I know a lot of people aren't paying attention at all. Like if something pops up about it, I always sort of have a look, and have been since the beginning of the pandemic. It's not over. It's a lot of COVID around at the moment. If you see a lot of countries, the numbers are just crazy. I mean, even in the UK, whooping cough is way up there. But one of the things that comes through is if you've had COVID, obviously take it easy and recover. But and I think we've all had it. We just didn't know, and we didn't test positive, but it's everywhere, including at the school. So when it's at the school, it's going to come home, right? Take it easy for at least a couple of weeks after you've had COVID. So exercise even after you get the vaccine, you're not supposed to do anything strenuous for 2 weeks. Yep. So after you've had COVID, take it easy, because that seems to be a pretty clear message coming through.
Yeah, and from what we're seeing with like the signs that Joe was sharing, is that historical story we had about, recover quick, get in, start getting back to your regular things isn't worth what is dangerous with COVID, because the depletion and that slower capacity to recover, when you start doing it, you drag back what your body was trying to gain, and it really pulls you back a lot. So really, it's a real gift to your future self, to your long-term health. Just go, okay, I might not like having to take the next 3 weeks slow. Yeah. And that would be the kindest, most gracious thing to do.
Yeah, it's like when I broke my foot, right? Heal it, or you'll have problems forever. So just moving on, so one of my favourite politicians is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC as we know. And she is going on going all in on deep fake pornography generated by AI, calling it sexual violence. So you got to listen to these numbers. So this was quoted in a Newsmax article, because yes, I read everything. Since the public release of AI tools, out of all the images and videos that AI has generated, over 90 to 95% of it has been non-consensual deepfake pornography, and over 90% of that is targeting women. She says, this is sexual violence. As a prominent and visible female elected official, I've been personally targeted by this, but it's not just prominent people in the limelight. What is actually concerning is the way that it is being used to target women every day. And if you're a woman who's starting any kind of business or aspiring to something, or becoming a teacher or running for office, you are overwhelmingly facing the risk of being targeted by this kind of reputational sexual violence that is at its core exploitative. So, when I listen to this, and the numbers are just crazy, right? And we've seen it happen. Taylor Swift had a deep AI fake. It's beyond AI that this is happening on social media. We've seen a lot of prominent female politicians just say, I've had enough, I'm out, it's too ugly. They're just being attacked all the time, death threats, threats of rape, threats of violence, you name it. And now we've got this whole new layer with AI. So I think it's really, really important. And to the ladies out there, it's really important. No matter what, we never let anyone silence our voices. But to all the good people out there, we need to come together and overcome these challenges, because it's really, really huge. So it's good to see America in the White House is taking a stance and trying to find a solution. But globally, we need to be looking at this. All right, Anna.
So on to the next one. So AI doing all that damage, and then it's also doing a lot of damage to the environment. The growth in AI systems is using so much compute power. Techie over here, but that compute power requires processing engines, which requires energy, which requires resources, which contributes heat, and just generally really not good for the environment. So David, just in case you haven't gathered, there's some bad stuff happening on the environment side. Anyhow, so on a cheerful note, David King published an opinion piece in The Guardian this week entitled "Humanity's Survival is Still Within Our Grasp," but with a big dash, just. And it does taking some radical steps. So those of you who've been following the climate conversations would have heard about the 4 R's of reducing emissions, building resilience, repairing ecosystems, and removing greenhouse gases. But we need them. So, and this has so many economic impacts that's a topic for another whole thing, and we can really talk eco-geeky stuff, which is another dangerous thing if it's me involved. But what we're already seeing is, Greenland ice sheets are hemorrhaging. Over the last 15 years, the Arctic Circle has been heating up at 4 times the global average. So it's now 3 degrees above where it was in 1980. So these days you can actually ship through it nearly all the year, whereas back in the day, the Antarctic Passage was it was challenging and a huge rite of seafaring genius, and now it's practically normal. I mean, that's just like a real signal of change. Last year, we were seeing an amazing amount of Antarctic ice from the southern hemisphere lost. And so, people sort of go like, yeah, those are ice cubes a long way away. What's that really going to do? But these ice cubes a long way away are actually, as they melt, which is doing a bit to help keep the temperature overall down, just because this is what our ice cubes do in our, in our glass of water, right? But what's also happening is because those haven't been part of the sea levels, that water is draining into the sea levels, and we're already 6 inches of sea rise doesn't seem like an awful lot. But I've been speaking to, but 6 inches of sea level rise means that if you're living near the sea coast, an awful lot of the infrastructure, like the roads, even the ferries and port systems, literally can't cope with that little extra up. The bigger what was needed, so that the engineering that wouldn't have necessarily been designed in. So we'll be seeing not just the landslides coming from the mountains, we'll also be seeing different sorts of erosions and collapses at the sea coast. And this is why in the ASEAN region, it's such a big issue, because we're one of the most densely island-based regions of the world. So, this is, right up on our doorstep. So anyhow, so his cheerful note here is, if we continue on the current path, i.e. this 3.5 one, which was an improvement on the 7.5, civilization as we know it will just disappear. So, here's the key thing is, planet Earth is going to be doing just fine. Planet Earth has been around for 4.5 billion years. Hashtag just saying, has a long track record of survival. Humanity been around, 30, 40,000 years, tiny little fraction of the time. Yeah, the question is really, is our civilization going to survive on this one? So, some of the really practical things getting in this one is, go and read his full explanation, because it's in depth. He's done a lot around this one. But the key thing is, because we were talking about communication earlier, is that you can motivate people for a certain amount when we talk fear. And there's a good number of people where fear is the thing that gets them to move. But it equally puts people into freeze and inaction, the good old fight and flight type responses lock in, which is not a very constructive moving forward conversation. So one of the more powerful ways is this firmness of going, well, that's one world, we could be like the Mad Max world. However, if we start talking about the narrative as, where can we find joy in the positive, constructive type actions? Where do we find joy through appreciating nature? We start valuing, that it also creates a space for value. Where do we find fulfillment from having quality things rather than quantity? Where do we find joy in refurbishing and repurposing something rather than using it once and dishing it out? All, just like if we can help shift ourselves to slightly different frames of where we get joy, where we get satisfaction, where we get pleasure, we create a different pathway of the resources we use and the materials that we use and the way we value nature. So
that's so true.
That's sort of to try and finish on a slightly more cheerful note on this rather big topic.
Yeah, but that's true. Yeah, and I've personally experienced it for our family. For the last number of years, we've been every day working towards living a better and a more sort of a present life, more in alignment with nature. We're imperfect, just like everybody, but there is a joy in it. There is, and like people fear it, and it's like what needs to go away isn't adding any value to our lives. We think it is, because we've been marketed it our entire lives to tell us that it is of value, but it's actually not. So once you start clearing out the noise of consumption and start to be more conscious about how you live in the world, it's a joy. It's not a sacrifice.
Yeah.
Well, I think it also comes from this the holes in your psyche, right? The holes in your life, as in you only. Well, I'll speak for myself. I only visit the fridge late at night if I'm feeling a bit unhappy. I think it's about replacement of joy, rather replacement of the source of joy, because I think there's only so much room for joy. There's the joy overload, right? You can have enough of what you have and all that. And
you can be satiated, can't you?
Yeah, but you can if you've had, okay, so the way I look at this is that if you're happy enough doing one set of things, you don't look for this next set of things, right? So if you're really happy about the life you had, the family and everything you've got around you and all that, you don't feel like you also have to get that new bag from Hermes, right? I mean, it's not you've got enough joy happening for everything, so you don't feel like some a sense of compensation. I feel like we're all these machines. We're almost like thermostats where we go like, oh, I'm unhappy here, so I got to kind of compensate with something else on this side. And the life that we lead tends to lead us that way. It's like, the reason why marketing works to say you need this thing is because there's enough of a hook for them to hook onto to make you go like, yeah, I guess I could feel that. I mean, like, when someone comes around at dinner time, let's say in a restaurant, and you've had your fill, and even if they bring you another steak, you don't go like, oh, I gotta have that, right? It's because you've had enough. It's satiation. So it's about the replacement, I think, of joy, and we've had. I think that there've been studies, even forget human beings, even with mice. If you can provide them with activity and community, yes, we're talking about rats here.
Yeah.
They will ignore the water that comes with the drugs, right? And that's
Yeah.
a real study, and it's not because they're not going to get any joy from the drugs, because drugs be good, I guess, but it's because you can fill your joy tank in another way. So I'm cautious to say that, you know what, we've got to try to say replace what makes us happy. I think there are lots of things that make us happy. We've just got to find those things, do more of those things, so that we have less gaps that we have to fill with something else.
Mm. Yeah. Did I say replace? Did I use that
Well,
word?
it's just a feeling I had from that, as I'm like, we've got to try, like it's like the flip side, like doing things. Okay, it's like doing things for the environment, I think, was it's the literal flip side of things. I think we could do things that were not to do with the environment at all and have nothing to do with making the environment better, that could also still produce the kind of results. So that's my kind of thought, as in, like, if we just had better relationships in general, if we just spent time talking to each other, if it was part of what we really treasured, it
Mm.
would have nothing directly to do with fixing the environment, but it would fix the environment.
Yeah. So I suppose for me, my thought process is how can I and my family live more in harmony with Earth? And what in my way of life is not in harmony with the planet? That's the question.
Mm.
So chemicals, plastic, meat. We don't really do fast food. I've got teenage boys. They have it more than I would like,
Yeah.
and I don't stop them. That's their choice. It's their bodies. I'd prefer they didn't do it, but I send them articles talking about the amount of chemicals in fast food. So that's fine. You can eat it, but at least be informed about what you're eating rather than just ignoring the reality. But based on Anna's time and her commitments, I thought, why don't we move into the show must go on, the theme, which comes from quite a personal place today. It's Joe's suggestion. And before he starts, because it's quite raw for him, I just want to talk about an experience I had. So last year in February, my husband was rushed off into hospital. Um, and he spent the first week in ICU and the second week in a ward, and it was an incredibly intense experience. And I just remember my brain became like my brain operated in a way that has never happened before. And it was on one side it was survival, on the other side it was um, like how do I even think about this? Like, how do I even feel about this? Like I didn't even know, and I wasn't getting any sleep, and it was all chaos, right? And I had no idea if he would survive. And I remember so he went in on one Saturday. The following Saturday, I put up my weekend reads, and someone said to me, "You shouldn't be doing that." And I'm like, "I shouldn't be doing that. I shouldn't. Why do people think that they know what I should be doing right now? Because I don't even know what I should be doing." And people are like, the message, take care of yourselves, have a break. And the reality is, when you're in these situations, you're like a fractured human. And thankfully, it came out well. But one of the things I was really conscious of at the time is I was dealing with all of these feelings and emotions and fears and worries for Steve and our family, and what the hell would we do if we lost him? And I didn't know what we would do. But on the other side, I couldn't get out of the space I was sitting in when it came to all of the other issues that are going on in the world. And I had this very real feeling of what I'm experiencing now is what so many people in the world, especially in poorer parts of the world, are experiencing. The worry, the experiences of loss or real serious injuries. And so I couldn't disconnect from that either. So the emotional intensity of that time was something I've never really spoken about. And because I didn't really know who I could speak to about it. And then the other day, Joe shared with me that he's in a really critical situation, but it's looking okay now, right? And I think
it's looking better.
But I think, looking at the excess deaths that are happening around the world, I think it's good for us to be able to talk about this sort of stuff, and maybe we can offer some wisdom to people about, anything that we've learned in the journey. So, Joe, do you want to jump in?
Okay, well, I'll try and tell you what's happening. I mean, we have a child who has muscular dystrophy, Duchenne muscular dystrophy, which once you discover it, essentially it's a terminal condition. At some point, your child's going to expire, and you kind of have an idea about the various ways it will happen. So this past 2 weeks, our child has been coughing, and the cough got worse. And then the O2 levels began to drop. And then we sent her to hospital. And then a whole series of things that, from our perspective, that we anticipated and dreaded for a long time began to happen. So it's... basically at the peak of everything that was happening, she was in ICU. We just received the news that she had been intubated, and in terms of frame of reference, if you come out of the COVID period, you would have known that usually when you have COVID and it gets to the point of intubation, that's usually that's the turn for the worse. So in our frame of mind, we thought, okay, we were there, and this was it, right? Yeah. And against that background as well, I also knew that we had this show to do, which is the No Show, and not just this show; it's everything else in my life as well. And what I also feel is the sense of carrying on despite what's happening. So, and it's to the chagrin of some family members as well. So, like the people who said to you, you shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah.
It's just the way I think. I'm just built a bit different. I can only share with you first of all how it works for me, and then maybe I can say the things that will get me canceled later, right? But for now, this is it. I mean, I always feel that there are things that you say you will do, and you will just continue to do because that's what you are and that's who you are. So for me, it's always been the case. I will show up. Maybe I'll let you know that something isn't quite right, but I'll get it done. And that's kind of where I came from as well. So I heard that, Anna, you've had a tough time recently as well with your father.
Yeah, my stepfather has been at that sort of, speaking of COVID and intubation, just as COVID started, he was in ICU and on oxygen for 10 days. Like we didn't expect him to get through that, and he did. Complete miracle man, and sort of came up, and then the last 5 months has been just happening. And my birth father passed away at 52, and my stepfather's passed away now at 87. So I've had privilege of having two wonderful men in that role in my life. And this one of the pieces that I've just found so different this time round is that before, when my dad was dying, I couldn't be down there because I couldn't work away from the office, whereas now we could. And so, of the last 5 months, I've spent at least 12, if not more, weeks down in Tasmania with the family and being able to visit him. And it's just, that gift of being able to be there with your family, with that connection to that relationship piece that you're talking about, Joe, just like tremendous. And I came back in the middle of April, and he passed away 2 days later. And that Friday, so that was the Wednesday. I came back on a Monday. That was on a Wednesday. On the Friday, I was giving a talk around, funnily enough, sustainability in business. And at one stage in the room, something was said, and I said to them, "Look, I can't." So I said, "Sorry, my brain's just not processing." So I can't remember that. I know it's somewhere in the mental files or on the laptop. I said, "But this is, my stepfather just passed away 2 days ago, and it's just." And everyone was just beautiful. It was just like, okay, we get. Thank you for being here. Are you okay? It's like, actually, being to the point of the show going on, there's a part of me that being able to still function has value for me. That this may not be true for other people. And then I was, but I also know that the emotions are more fragile. But so I'm taking a lot more time for me and just going like, is it going to be of service being out with people and that human connection? Is it, there's some places where the show needs to go on because I've made the commitment and promise, and that's part of me holding me together. And there's some places where actually, I need to just be kind to myself and go and just have a bit of quiet without all the other pressures.
Yeah. So, I suppose when it's sort of listening. So, but Joe, we've had some good news about your daughter too, right? She's doing well.
Yeah. So yeah, she's doing better than we thought she might be. So when we had the initial news, we thought, well, this was what we've always prepared for, and this is the worst of it happening. But she seems to be responding quite well. She's still in ICU, but we're working out some communication stuff and all that. And I think always a good sign about recovery is when you start to get irritated over the small things. So we're getting back to that stage again. So I think there's definitely light at the end of the tunnel for this episode.
Oh, you got to find the comedy. I remember one night Steve was tied up to so many things on his body, and he wanted to show me how brave he was. So he got up in the middle of the night to go to the toilet himself, and he just completely fell out of the bed. And it was really funny because but you have to find the humor in it, right? But okay. I hope she's all right and sending our love. But I suppose the lesson is none of us know how we're going to be in a situation like this, and in a extreme stress, emotional intensity, grief. None of us know how we're going to be, right?
Well, this is the kind of this is the part where I get cancelled, right? I think we should actually know what we're going to be like. I think the great gift of being a human being with the imaginations that we have is we have a very good way of figuring out what things are going to be like. And as much as we are very good at saying what we should have done in the minutes that follow a moment, we are equally capable of deciding those things ahead of time. And it's a useful way to cope with things. I mean, we need to. I think people would be served quite well by rehearsing disaster, and it sounds terrible as an idea, but it's what I do in my professional life. I try to talk to people about this and say, listen, if you are prepared for all the worst things that could happen, and you are legitimately prepared, you're not just prepared conceptually that these things will happen, but you go like, if this happens, then we do that. If this happens, then we do that. If this also happens, then we do that. Then in the moment, you're still gonna feel the stress. You still know that that's gonna be you recognize shit when you see it, but you know what's gonna happen next. It's gonna take you out of it, and it helps quite a bit. I mean, one of the surprising aspects of things is because between my wife and I, in terms of who's really in touch with emotions, it's my wife. She's more the emotional person, and therefore I'm the guy who gets in trouble more often. But that's a different story. She was stronger through this than I expected her to be, and than she expected to be. And a lot of it was because we had thought about this for as long as we we had thought about all the things that go along with that, so that now that the moment's arrived, it really didn't hit her as much as she thought it would, right? And I think a lot of us could do with that. Okay, so the other thing that I was gonna, the other part where I was warning you that I'd be a little bit ultra conservative in my idea about this is that as much as we talk about mental health and giving space to people to process and all those things, right? I think what we've done is we've and I don't say we've done it, but society currently is driving people to trying to find their victimhood, trying to find the way that life is bad and it's tough and it's hopeless. They're a little bit driven by that, and it's a little bit to do with the way social media works. I was just looking around and seeing how when a piece of news is released, and what I try to do when we talk about the news that we share as well, is to not make it too complicated so that people have to respond. But I find that we're designed, society's right now designed to almost rush in with the response to something that needs compassion. So the big posts that happen even on LinkedIn have to do with these moments when there's some sort of and I'm not saying major assault, but some kind of emotional thing to be dealt with, some kind of big challenge, and people get it's almost like they're drawn to it, and almost it's like everyone's looking for their thing as well, their way to get to be hard done by, So I don't know whether we're in a place where we are less resilient because we're not thinking about what's beyond that. We just see the reward of attention and go like, that's they got lots of attention for that. I know it's not a fully crystallized idea, but I just thought how
I'm with you.
Yeah.
I was just saying, because I was going to say when we're not resilient, so 50, 60 years, especially in wealthy Western societies, life's been pretty good. The conversation around military service in the UK as part of the election, I think it was a little bit misguided by the Tories to present that. But I don't think it's a bad thing to have military service. My boys will be doing military service, and I'm really happy that they're going to be doing it because they're going to learn skills they're going to need. But I think it's a good way to develop resilience because you have to go through a lot of discomfort in a lot of different ways, whether it's sleeping with other people in a room or sleeping out in the jungle and getting bitten by bugs or just all of it, right? But we're not a very resilient species anymore, and we've lost it, and I think we need to get it back. So I agree with that. The presumption of how you should be, how you should feel, I think I agree with you, Joe. Like I'm pretty confident in a crisis that I'm going to be okay and be able to handle it. I can go into a zone of, all right, what do I need to do? What's important? I can do that and be strong. I haven't broken yet in my life, so I'm pretty confident where I'm going to be. But Anna, what do you reckon?
I think we each respond to the best we know how. And some people, to Joe's comment, have found that the victim position is something that they find supportive for them. I mean, just to be fair about the fact that not everyone has the same coping strategies.
Yeah.
And same ways of responding. And to also be open to the fact, just because we feel we can hold it together doesn't mean that that's easy for other people.
No, absolutely not.
And that, which is why I find it the healthiest way is to go. If I look at people are responding from the best that they can in the moment, and they've got all their other things, all their other shows that they're trying to keep going on as well, most of the time, which even when they're close family members, we have absolutely no idea about.
Yeah.
But I find like I can be the most great, I suppose, Joe, to like my imagination has been, how can I be the most gracious person possible in the circumstances? Some of it's going like, every now and again I've had my meltdowns. I've got a lot better of going, if I'm out in public and something's happening and like even if it was in a work thing, like at that meeting I was talking about, and tears come up, I'm no longer worried about that. My old me would have been very, I'm just going like, okay, it is an intense emotional time. And if other people have a problem with it, I respectfully allow them to have their own problem.
Yeah.
And vice versa, because, they're in it, there's dynamics where, like, in my family, we're all A-type personalities. So you can just imagine a whole bunch of A-type personalities organizing this whole stuff. Oh my God. The amazing thing is we actually generally got through it. I think in part because we learned to laugh at each other's A-typeness.
What does an A-type funeral look like?
Well, we all have our shit together and the show is going to go on. But we're still also in that but it's still, there's still the pain and the grief in us that's flicking off each other. And therefore things, no one is in the space of trying to make somebody else miserable in our circumstance, but it doesn't mean that we weren't reacting, that we're responding to each other in ways that made us. So it's, this phrase, the show must go on, in some ways, the whole theater thing is if you've made that commitment, get out and do it, and you can have your meltdown afterwards behind the scenes.
Yeah. But then you got to let your meltdown come through too, right? So you see people holding it together for so strong, and when they finally burst, they really burst, and it could be so much further down the track that no one really kind of understands. And one of my chapters in my book is let people be dicks sometimes, and it's all about like,
I like that one.
However we show up, right? Sometimes we show up in like someone pulled me up the other day, and they said, like, it wasn't long after Steve got out of hospital, I said something that was really out of character, and they pulled me up for it. And I'm like, yeah, let people be dicks sometimes, mate. I mean, I can't explain that. It's just, that comes out of your mouth, right? And what you need is the people around you to go, no, fair enough, mate. We appreciate where you are. But I do think it's a really important time to pay attention to resilience, mental health, like, how do you strengthen your mind? And not everyone's going to be able to do this, like we've said, but understanding this area, there's a lot of amazing people who are speaking up about it. Really find the people who speak to you. Being a victim, not going to help any of us, especially in the challenging years ahead. But we're all going to be going through more of what we're talking about here in different ways. There's a lot of people in India and Pakistan going through this as they have to bury their
Philippines
dead.
too.
In the Philippines, Burma, Papua New Guinea, obviously in America, 19 people died in those storms across four states. So there's people grieving, so there's a lot, that's just going to keep growing and growing as escalation continues. So I think, and some people don't want to face this stuff, right? They don't want to face it at all. And I kind of get that too, but it's not really going to protect you down the track. But
I think what kind of needs to happen is we need to go deeper into the meaning of what mental health is about, because right now it's the fashionable term, right? So it's very fashionable, and everybody's like, I'm just, I'm concerned about my mental health, and they take the nearest version of that story that they think is appropriate, and then it seems to fit them, and they go like, oh, I'm doing this right now for my mental health. And when you understand more of it, and people can understand that it's a much bigger thing than just those two words. It is multi-dimensional. It could there's so many aspects of it that people don't consider beyond the actual first moment, right? A lot of people just think it's just about feeling good, for instance, or like we look for therapy just so that we can feel good, as opposed to analysis, where we might try to solve the problems so that we can be okay with it 20 years from now, so that we can cope, so that we can build better systems and what have you. There has to be there's no, I'm trying to find a less clumsy way of saying it, but we have to have less superficiality.
Yeah,
that's a very clumsy way of saying it, but that's what we are. We're a world who, like we go like, now if you're in a company and you're doing a launch, or you're saying some kind of thing in your press release, whatever it is, you'll be pulled aside because we haven't mentioned AI.
Mm.
and it's like, what is AI really? Well, most people don't know, don't understand where machine language sits in the middle of all that, and then LL, all these different things that make up AI, but they know they have to talk about AI. So I
Yeah.
think we're like that when it comes to mental health. We are trying to be appropriate in our reaction to things, and so we want to give people space for mental health issues, for instance, but we don't do what we need to do to make sure that really happens. As in, like, if you see someone and they have a problem, we don't just step aside and just let them be necessarily. At some point, someone's got to go do something. Someone's got to go into the space and say, hey, are you okay? What can we do? Something has to happen along the way, as opposed to just going like, yeah, no, it's a thing. We'll just accept it. Everything, we accept everything. We can't. um I think if we take it on that mental health is important, then we really have to take it on a bigger scale. I don't want to see mental health just being about how do we get better with our feelings, but I want it to be so that how do we design a world that is better so that it doesn't cause these feelings.
Yeah. Amen.
Mhm.
All right. So should we wrap up? Unless Anna, have you got anything you want to finally say?
Because I'll go use the theme as the point, is that I think there's a huge power in whatever turbulence we have happen in our lives, and life does seem to have its turbulence, is to work out for yourself which pieces, because I've had to be doing this in the last while, of which pieces do I feel the show has to go on, and it isn't everything. And then be happy with some of the other pieces and just going, yes, there's downside. I mean, Joe, you're like earlier on, like there's things that if I go from the forward planning point of view that I could have got sorted and haven't. Oh, well, the show is still going on. So, watch this space. But when we start going like, these are the pieces that I want my show to keep going on, and these are the pieces I'm happy to let go because there's something else that's even more important, which may be to be able to be present and witness someone who's going through a very difficult circumstance, which may be an emotional health thing. It could be the sorts of things that we've been talking about in terms of family members who, may be dying, possibly be dying, or an infinite number of other things. I mean, there's lots of stuff that happens in life. And then going like, the important things can get picked up and move forward. Because I've found, I can't do all the shows all the time, but I can pick some of the shows to keep going on and then be present to some of the other things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that. All right. So what's keeping you distracted when you have an opportunity? Because I'm sure that
Well,
there's lots of
I have
distractions.
no room for distractions at this. But hang on, actually, that's a lie. In my bid to have the show continue, I have bought a whole bunch of new software that I'm also trying to get my head around, and I'm making an obligation to myself to fix in the next few weeks. But I want to, instead of using my time for the distractions, I want to give out some thinking to process, and this has to do with turbulence, which you mentioned a moment ago. So there's been a lot of news about turbulence, the SIA flight, and then the death that ensued from that, and then after that, some other turbulence news came up as well. And I wanted to share something which I think is going to be the flip side of this, which can be quite scary. Is in like there are going to be a lot of people right now who are traveling long haul flights, and they're going to be armed with the advice, perhaps the thought themselves, that they have to sit down the whole time and basically be belted in. All right. And I've spoken to a pilot about this yesterday as well. First of all, in terms of the perception that the rules have changed around flying, they have not. The pilots have not been told to do anything different. The advice is still the same. And the best advice is this. If you're on a long haul flight, do what you need to do on a long haul flight, which is still to move. But when you're not moving, be in your seat and then have the seatbelt on. Because if you end up just sitting for 15 hours, you're facing a very real risk of deep vein thrombosis and other kinds of illnesses which come without moving. So I just wanted to share that with you. If you're on a long haul flight, if you have an older person who's going on a long haul flight, like in our case, I advise that to Adel's auntie who was traveling on this really long flight. Please do the things that will make you safest, which is movement while the flight is going on. But when you're in your seat, please have your seat belts on, and that combination would have you in a much better place than if you decide to just overreact and sit down the whole way.
I always take an aspirin, but the turbulence thing, it's an interesting part of the climate conversation. So, but yeah. I know what's keeping you distracted. You're usually reading something fantastic.
I have just ordered this morning, so it's going to be my weekend distractions. Thank you, supply chains that can deliver a book within a day. A book called The Surrender Experiment. Which will be, so I'm looking forward to that. That's sort of, in some ways, definitely distraction from all the other things in life that's going on.
All right. Well, I'm not very good at distracting myself in many ways. So there's a podcast series called The Tipping Points, and it's actually the story of the people who wrote the book for the Club of Rome back in the 1970s that predicted by the 2020s we'd be exactly where we are now. It's quite a profound and moving story of this young couple who decided to write it, all the shit that they got for doing it, as well as the fact that, they pretty much on the money with the results they were predicting sort of 50 years later. So it's called Tipping Points. It's a podcast. I put it in a weekend reads a couple of weeks ago, but I would definitely recommend that. So that's mine. Now I need to go and watch something a little bit more lighthearted and fluffy and silly, because sometimes you need that too, right? All right, guys.
Absolutely.
Anna, thank you so much for joining us and for saying yes, because we had our guest pull out at the last minute, and then Tim's off with his family after all of his intense studies. So really appreciate you jumping in and being back on the show, and I'm sure we'll see you again. And Joe, keep us posted on your news.
Yeah, will do. Thank you, everybody, for spending some time with us today and watching as well. I'm going to do something on this that we never do. We should be doing, because if we're serious about social media, please like and subscribe, share, all the kind of stuff that actually helps something like this, spread. I think what you've done, Andrea, with this is really something that deserves to have much more traction than it's getting right now. And it's partly because we don't spend any time, I think, on the hacking of the social media, which, well, I'm sorry, you spend all the time on social media. I think I'm not doing enough of it, but I'm gonna ask anybody. Yeah, I'm gonna ask anybody who's finding this message or what's been spoken about today as important to be shared with others, to do that. And if you can help us with the work around that, it would mean like you find something that you like along the way, and don't just share the whole thing, because it looks like a big thing to try and digest, right? It's a 90-minute to an hour thing. But if you clip it on YouTube, for instance, and say this particular thing, this is a useful thing, this is important to hear, and you share that would help. And of course, like and subscribe. That kind of thing always helps as well.
Cool. Yeah, I'm not the hustling type. That's my problem. But anyway, we will see you soon. All right. Well, got a couple of weeks. Climate Courage next Friday. We're going to be talking about the media, being on the front line in the media and the climate conversation. So come and check it out. Robin Hicks is going to come and join us, and that's going to be a very interesting conversation. All right. We'll see everyone soon.